This is lecture number 6 in the International Human Rights course. I'd like to reflect with you for a time on the whole issue of approaching human rights from an events or historic situation in which obviously tragedies occur and the world focuses on particular countries given rather graphic and raw human rights violations. And then the structures which exist within states or are meant to exist within states that protect human rights, and how within the human rights ideological battle there are those who swing to the right in that and they ignore other rights, those who swing to the left, and then a third model which tries to integrate these rights traditions in some minimally imperfect manner, and yet both in theory and practice they attempt to do that. And then the relationship of those 6 rights to ecological rights, and we'll move into areas as we move in the course, animal rights itself. So let me start with historic events in which people legitimately and rightly so will focus on graphic and poignant human rights violations within states that have to be dealt with. Some happen over periods of time, they accelerate, and then the implications are sad for one and all. Some happen at a hasty pace, but nonetheless the results are horrendous. But they're historic events. So in our readings thus far in the course, we in fact have looked at a variety of historic events in which people from various backgrounds, religious, ethnic, religious persuasions differ, and then how a certain state that comes in power oppresses them. So in our reading so far, we've looked at Iran and treatment of Baha'i in Iran, and particularly with Khomeini coming to power, replacing the Shah in 1979 and moving in an accelerated way. Treated anyone who differed with this Shiite form of Islam. And traditionally, Shia Islam has not always been particularly engaged politically, but within this merging of spirituality, theology, and politics under Khomeini and those who have followed him, there's a Shiite form of political nationalism in Iran. And the Baha'i were treated horrendously within Iran itself. So here's a particular historic event in which a people who come out of the Islamic tradition, but obviously see and interpret it quite differently, are persecuted, and many of them had to flee. In not only Iranians themselves, who were somewhat more moderate and liberal and would not buy into that extreme form of jihadist Islam, but the Baha'i themselves. Here's a historic event in which a change of regime comes in and the implications. The second historic event we've looked at was with the breakup of Yugoslavia, with ending of the Soviet Union, the 1989, 1981 under Gorbachev. You have many of the former Soviet client states begin to implode, and certainly in the former Yugoslavia, the under the surface ethnic historic backgrounds in which some ethnic people feel they have been marginalized and mistreated by Muslims historically gave rise to Serbian nationalism under Milosevic, and the treatments in Sarajevo and Srebrenica and many other of these fragmented states that Tito once held together in some sort of minimal balance and stability. So over a 10-year period plus, we can see in Yugoslavia the outrageous treatment of those who were not Serbian nationalists and those who dared to oppose them, and the attempt by the end of that period of the UN and international law to deal with them. The third, which you will have read, would be the accelerated situation in Rwanda, in which literally within a few months, even though the history of it goes much older in terms of treatment of Hutu and Tutsi and Belgium and previous states aligning themselves to one ethnic group against the other, which then inevitably leads to jealousy and anger and vindictiveness in time when the former group which was victimized, they're the ones who get the power, then they victimize those who were once the powerless. a very classic story. But there's another historic situation in which rights are violated. The world initially didn't respond, largely because of faux pas in Somalia and the acting American government that went bad in many ways, hence hesitant to become involved in the Rwanda situation. But yet another historic event in which human rights were violated, eventually dealt with, and of course Truth and Reconciliation Commissions has followed since then, attempt to bring the Hutu and the Tutsi together, both those who were engaged in these crimes against humanity, and how reconciliation can come out of tragedy. But those are three events, historic events, and of course we could track that, many people do, to Europe, middle of the 20th century, Germany, Jews, Italy, Franco's Spain, Japanese nationalism. These are historic events in which people can get focused on them, but there's more to human rights than merely historic events which reveal atrocities of violations. I want to move on to historic events, to structures by which ideology in human rights works itself out. There's the right-wing approach to human rights. There's the left-wing approach to human rights. There's the centrist approach to human rights, a more integrated model. And then there has come to be, in the last few decades, a commitment to the ecological rights and the relationship of ecology and humanity, in making sense of how, in a symbiotic way, these two different approaches work together for the good of both. And then in the last couple of decades, animal rights itself. If a person comes from the right-wing tradition, which is the English elements of the English American tradition, the three rights which are called first-generation rights, which are held high, are political rights, civil rights, and legal rights. And within the Anglo-American tradition, the argument was historically that at a political level, only certain people had access to the halls of power. If a person came from a wealthy family, an aristocratic family, pre-voting, then if people came from middle or lower classes, they had no right to belong to political parties, no right to vote. Civil rights is freedom of publication, freedom of assembly, freedom protest, freedom to be dissidents. People were immediately arrested or disappeared in these rights. And so within this first generation rights, the sense was that if we take the argument of liberty and equality, choice, agency, individuality, acting or willing in that sense, then why should certain people have the right to belong to political parties because of birth and breeding, or even because of entrepreneurial success, the emerging middle class, but working class people, women, people of color did not have that access. And the same with legal rights, which are part of that basket of first generation of rights, is if you couldn't pay for a lawyer, you didn't have access to the courts, and then you would be the victim of terrible injustice, whether it's the blacks in the South or the slave trading that went on, or First Nations peoples. And so this first generation of rights took the position that all should have the right to form political parties, to participate in the political process, to have access to voting. People should have the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of publication, freedom to dissent without fear of a state stepping in through police or the military and people being hauled off to jail or disappearing. And then people should have access. And if they can't afford lawyers, then it is the role of the state, as much and as far as possible, to provide access to law so people can be tried justly, fairly, and speedily. Some trials can be fair, but not done in haste. Some can be done in haste, but they're not fair. So it was the role of the state then. So who is the agency of protecting these rights within the first generation of rights? Well, certainly within elements of the European and Anglo-American tradition. It was the state's role to guarantee for their citizens that one and all who were citizens of these particular countries or states would have access without fear, without losing their security, of participating in the political process via voting, belonging to civil rights, and when there was any acts of injustice committed, they should have access to courts, and if they could not support them, then it was the role of various organizations to create the possibilities and the conditions for people to have access to legal rights themselves. That's what we call the first generation of rights. Now, the dilemma of merely having political, civil, legal rights protected by the state does not mean necessarily that people are going to have work, they're not going to have fair income, the different cultures are not going to be properly understood in their history, working conditions for people, income, housing, healthcare, education, all of these rights which are considered second generation rights that are about economic, social, and cultural rights are protected. Within the first generation of rights, the argument is that these rights, it's not that they're not important, but it's not the role of the state to guarantee those rights. That's the role of society. It's the role of the individual. It's the role of family. It's the role of community. It's the role of the voluntary sector to provide for health care and education, adequate working conditions, minimum income, benefits for working. That's not the role of the state. You leave that to the market, and you leave it to society to provide for those goods. Now, the second generation of rights, which is the left wing of rights versus the right wing of rights, came along and said, basically, society in and of itself does not have the means and is not competent enough to protect those particular rights. And it is the role of the state to guarantee certain social rights, economic rights, cultural rights, and you can't leave that up to the whims of society itself. Now, the dilemma of the second generation of rights, as it unfolded, was that at times, in the name of protecting social, economic, cultural rights, often for working class, for, in leftist terms, various understandings of Marxism, the working class, proletariat, the peasants, the kulaks in Russia, is that there would obviously be opposition to that, and so they're quite willing, say in the Russian experience and the Chinese experience, elements of the Cuban experience, they're quite willing to repress political, civil, and legal rights for the purpose of guaranteeing social, economic, and cultural rights. And so some of often the atrocities that the right, when they look at the left, will see the repression of political, civil, legal rights, but then the left, or second generation rights, will look at the immense poverty, living conditions, lack of adequate health care in right-wing governments that hold political, civil, legal rights high. So between the first generation of rights, which we find largely in liberal democratic traditions, elements of the Euro, Anglo-American, Canadian, we find it in other liberal democracies, which is strong on the states guaranteeing political, civil, legal rights. But the weakness of that one-dimensional approach to rights created the second generation of rights, of which we see leftist traditions. The French Revolution is very important in that. But as a result of the French Revolution, some of the terrible atrocities in terms of undermining political, civil, legal rights, guillotining, the violence, the tragedies which occurred there. And then fast forward that into the Chinese Revolution, going back from Mao Zedong to where we are today, where political, civil, legal rights are very much minimalized and marginalized, but the attempt to guarantee social, cultural, economic rights. The third generation of rights, which we find in significant elements of Europe and Canada, as it's torn between the European model and elements of the leftist Labour English model, and the more right-of-centre rights tradition in the United States tries to integrate these 6 elements of right, the political, civil, legal, arguing the state has a very important role in guaranteeing them, but the state also has an important role with society in guaranteeing political or social, economic, and cultural rights as well. It's this integrated and organic model we find in liberal democratic traditions that have attempted to integrate these. We find this initially played out in which the initial UN Declaration of Human Rights, December 10th, 1948, tended to lean a little more to the right. It was put together by Eleanor Roosevelt, an important Canadian lawyer. And the critique of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came about from leftist traditions that argued that economic, social, and cultural rights were being ignored. And as a result of that, in the 1970s at the UN, the covenants of political, civil, and legal rights and an equally important covenant of economic, social, cultural rights were brought together at the United Nations, and countries that signed on to both, as well as an optional protocol, were then responsible for guaranteeing these 6 major areas of rights were embodied within the legal process itself in their countries. And so this integration of first, second generation of rights within certain states in terms of the structure or how these states work themselves are an attempt to thread together in a meaningful manner these rights. Now, we obviously in the last few decades have encountered, increasingly so with global warming, ecological rights. And some of the liberal democratic traditions recognize merely to guarantee these are human rights. The movement, and so the argument, that's a very anthropocentric way of understanding the world. But as humans, we live in a physical world. We as humans live in relationship to nature itself, and nature and humanity live in this ongoing relationship. And if people in the name of profit or wealth pollute and distort, inevitably their human rights are going to be undermined by nature itself. And so we're beginning to see the impact today of polluting the world. And so the whole movement, beginnings, the Stockholm Declaration, and many others, has attempted to move into ecological rights and nature in relationship to human rights. So human rights and nature moving beyond a purely anthropocentric world. Now, there's also a movement as well afoot in the last few decades to deal with animal rights, because again, human rights are about humans, but what about humanity and nature, and what about humans and animals themselves? And so a significant amount of literature and activism has emerged in the last few decades, which deals with animal rights. And so, to conclude, there are human rights situations of historic events in which people look at them and realize the atrocities. But these, and people can focus on these and their aberrations, and there's many other countries that I've mentioned. Obviously, for example, in the lectures we're looking at, 9/11 was another graphic illustration for many Americans, in this case, of a historic event, yet once again, in which Americans suffered as a result of the bombings. And so we could look at the Iranian situation, Yugoslavian situation, Rwanda situation, 9/11. But to move forward into structures that embody human rights, the first generation, second generation, third generation's integrating, fourth is looking at ecological rights, and fifth is increasingly focusing on animal rights, and the larger attempt when people think rights to move beyond purely an anthropocentric view of the world, or and look at the broader notion of rights in terms of justice and peacemaking and ecological concerns.